It was perhaps the largest mistake he'd made in his life. His intention was not to kill the woman, merely to hurt her. He had been seeing her for some time and had, despite not particularly caring about her as a person, developed some manner of attachment to her in their incessant lovemaking. It didn't cross his mind that she might ever abandon him. By that time, Blake had been older, almost a teenager. The woman was really just a teen herself, but in the church she was considered an adult. Unbeknownst to him, she had decided that once she reached what was considered the age of adulthood, and legally the age of consent, she would cut ties with him. As she explained her decision, explained her reasoning, he felt the anger and rage growing inside him. She had ended her speech by telling him that originally she had intended to simply disappear from his life, and at most leave him a note. But as the years went by, according to her, he seemed to calm down a little. His anger seemed to subside. He didn't hear her at first. The woman whose name he never even knew tried to scream. They were far away from everyone, at the place where they regularly met to sneak away from the crowds of people who would undoubtedly judge them. Blake felt his mind go blank, and the world around him was a blinding white for what felt like only a few moments. When he came to, his hands were around the woman's throat, and her head was under the water. She wasn't moving. He removed his shaking hands, looked at them in shock and confusion. He thought hard about what had happened, tried to remember what she had said that made him so angry. He stayed at the lake for a long time, staring at her, little by little remembering what it was she had told him. It struck him then that she had been right. Only a year ago, if she had done the same thing, he would undoubtedly have murdered her deliberately and felt no remorse or shame for it. In fact, he was sure of it. He really was, even if only little by little, getting better, and the only person who had cared enough to notice was now dead by his own hands. Blake made up his mind to keep track of his progress as far and as much as possible, though he had no idea what his eventual goal was. Regardless, it was now the dominating thought of his mind, to make progress, to move forward, to do and be better. To what end, he decided he would only find out once he got there. As if by fate, his next lecture from the man was on the topic of innocence, the topic of children and God's view of them. He looked serious all through the long lecture, and the man had begun to wonder whether he really had chosen the right subject matter. He could have sworn that a voice whispered in his ear that this was what the boy needed to hear, more than anything. But Blake, in spite of almost always paying perfect attention to everything being said during these lectures, seemed distracted. The man had always tried to remain neutral in his approach to the child, knowing that any sign of affection or caring would be seen as a weakness, something Blake would no doubt try to take advantage of. But seeing him so distant and disconsolate made the man break. "What troubles you, son?" he eventually asked. Blake sighed, more deeply than he had ever heard a child sighing in his life, and told him that he did not believe there was any hope for him to be better, and that he had been trying for the entirety of the week to be better, but had, time and again, found himself returning to his old ways, bullying the other children, yelling at the teachers, stealing food and sweets. The priest listened, carefully, baffled. He had always assumed that Blake had no interest in trying to be better, but the fact that he was trying, that he wanted to improve, even if he was struggling to do so, was nothing short of a miracle. For not the first time in the presence of the child, he felt tears well up in his eyes, only now they were tears of joy, of gratitude, and hopefulness. He agreed to help Blake keep track of his sins. The first step, he insisted, was to know where one was at, and to work from there. Blake was sent home with a bit more homework than usual. He was to write down as much as he could remember of all that he did that was wrong throughout the week and report back to the priest. He was given a clean book especially for this, and realized, a little bemused, that he had not received a present that he could remember, ever in his life. The priest knew, of course, that as the weeks went by, there was a chance that Blake could lie to him, downplay his sins, pretend to be turning his life around, The priest took the risk, albeit a calculated one. Through all his years and through all the horrible things the child did, lying was not on the list. He had assumed it was because to Blake what he did was not wrong, and he felt no need or desire to hide it, or at the very least that he felt no shame, even if he did know those things were wrong. There were, even after all his years working with the boy, things that the priest simply did not know or understand about him. But through it all, he kept faith and endless patience with the boy. It was, he believed, God's will that he do so. The weeks went by and Blake did not feel that he was making any progress, felt a failure, felt disheartened. Although he was moving forward, he did not ever feel that he was making enough progress, did not ever feel that he was getting better fast enough. Still, the only sin he had ever committed that haunted him was the woman. The thought that he could still not feel guilt for what he did scared him and shook him, and it came to him in his dreams. His goal was still unclear to him. He did not feel that he could ever repent for all that he had done. But still, he tried, and still he kept track. The weeks became months, the months became years. The years eventually saw him into adulthood, at least by the church's standards. For legal reasons, he was kept in the orphanage, though it was not expected that he would ever be able to finish school. They had not believed that Blake had improved his life, and his actions had not noticed that he was getting suspended less, had for over a year not even received attention. Even so, to Blake, school was never a matter of interest. His only real interest was religion, and it had only ever been the lectures the priest gave him that he had been able to focus on, and nothing else. Though Blake had still maintained that he could not outrun his previous sins, could not believe that he could ever be forgiven, he had asked the priest about how he himself could become, in any way, part of the church. It was his only hope in the world. It was the thing he clung to for dear life. The only way that he could conceivably save his soul, that he could ever have anything remotely resembling a job, could possibly keep out of trouble. He had noticed through tears that the church was the closest thing he had had to a home, and the priest to a father. It was all he had. The priest wanted to take him in and train him, but knew that other people would be affected, and that he needed to find a way to convince the staff at the orphanage, as well as his wife, though he had shared with her everything, despite her not believing that the boy had really changed for the better. She maintained that although he had improved, there was still something that he held back, felt a dark secret hanging over him, even without being in his presence. And she was right. The only sins he had not confessed to through his entire life were killing the woman, and the fact that they were sleeping together. That he felt should be kept private, for her sake more so than his. But he knew that one day the truth would have to come out, and felt a growing anxiety about it the older he got, and finally broke down when he heard the man telling him that he could not become a priest. For the first time in his life, he sobbed miserably in front of his lifelong teacher, who could not but take pity on him. For the first time since he was a baby, Blake felt arms around him, and he sobbed into the priest's shirt and felt all of his strength abandon him as he cried and cried. The priest did what little he could to comfort him, and in the end made a promise that he would talk to the bishop about the possibility of Blake becoming a friar. It wasn't what he'd been aiming for, but it was enough of a comfort to get him to stop crying, and little by little calm down enough to go back to the orphanage for the day. Then he told Blake, almost to his own surprise, that he wanted him to meet his wife. That night, for the first time in his life, Blake prayed. He had not done so through all his years in Sunday school, through his time keeping track of his sins, working with the priest to try and be a better person. He had always assumed it was pointless. But that evening he simply had no idea what to do elsewise. On his knees, eyes closed, beginning to cry again, he heard a voice letting him know that he would be granted the position of friar, but only if he confessed what he did to Lisa. Lisa, he heard himself say. That's how he knew it was real. That the next day, when telling the truth for the first time about Lisa, The priest knew who he was talking about. At long last, they made their decision. The other children, who were no longer children but young adults, did not know what happened to Blake. People tended not to question it when members of the orphanage disappeared, Lisa included. Years upon years later, they still did not see him, though he was there, hidden away from everyone, in the back of the church, praying at all hours of his waking life. In the end, the priest passed away. The new friar boy was confused at the idea that Blake should not take his place, despite clearly being the best suited for the job. Though he rarely spoke to anyone by that time, lived out his life in silence and solitude. He only ever spoke to pray now. Every day, Lisa haunted him a little less. He still kept track of his sins, though now they were only in his mind. Things he thought of doing, realized were wrong, decided not to do. He had no doubt now that he had made progress after all, though he still did not believe that his mission was over. It was taking shape, slowly and carefully, and he still held clear faith, after all this time, that one day, his true goal in life would be made clear to him, by that selfsame voice who had given him the name he had not known, could not have known, without someone telling him. Thank you for listening and watching. All links and references are in the description below.